Good, and I see Kellen's here, which has been very useful. My talk today focuses on Houston and land use in Houston in particular. Now, Houston has a very odd wrinkle that some of you may be familiar with. We have no zoning. None. Well, not exactly none. But we have no formal zoning. It's the largest city in the country, by various counts, the fourth largest city in the country with no zoning at all. So you can effectively have a high-rise built next to a one-family house across the street from a supermarket. And there's really not much that can be done to stop it. Now, there are alternate means of stopping. For example, they have laws regarding the size of land use, the size of plots, how much space must be between properties, but there's no zones of residential, mixed, whatever. Okay, so historically, developers have had a pretty free reign to build what they want, where they want, assuming they meet all the various building codes and traffic studies and all that other stuff. But in Houston, for the past 7 years, there's been going an ongoing property saga that tests this law. This is what's called the Ashby Highrise. So near Rice University, which is a very, very affluent area, very expensive homes, there were proposals to build a mixed-use 23, 24-story condominium high-rise. And it would have been an entirely residential area. Now, this building had a lot of permitting issues. They were fighting over traffic. They were fighting over noise. And the means why this battle went so long was basically the neighbors tried to use their collective power to stop this. They didn't have the formal channels of zoning to attend a zoning meeting or perhaps a board meeting or try to submit petitions. There's nothing there. So what do? They actually took to the streets. They organized massive protests. They put lawn signs all over the area. I'm sure Kellen sees them all the time, saying, "Stop this Ashby." They call it the Tower of Terror, with this grimacing tower with these teeth and fangs. It's actually quite scary. They petitioned the mayor. They created a website. They did all these things which people with means can do. But they even did one thing that was really crazy. To illustrate how bad the traffic was, they organized a park-in, where they've actually parked their cars on the street during rush hour to simulate how bad the traffic was going to be. Now, only people who don't have to work during rush hour are able to pull off these kinds of stunts. But they did this, and this went on for year after year after year. And finally, after they satisfied the noise studies, after they satisfied the traffic studies, after they satisfied the shadow studies, the city finally said, okay, go ahead, build it. Okay? On the eve of construction, I was actually there, I saw them clearing the land, they filed a lawsuit alleging that the building was a nuisance. A nuisance? What do you mean a nuisance? Well, there were no allegations that there was any kind of vibrations or noise or light or traditional things that are nuisances. They alleged that what made it a nuisance was it was out of place, that it did not fit in with its. I need your help on this too. So they actually alleged that it was out of place. They said it was, quote, abnormal land use, and they actually brought a nuisance suit on the eve of construction. Well, making my presentation so much easier, a judge issued an opinion 2 days ago on this. I was so excited. Now I can actually talk about the judge's opinion. So they held a full trial on this. They had a full jury trial where the jury actually awarded almost $2 million in damages based on a nuisance theory. Bizarrely. And they basically said the 20 homeowners that are contiguous to this one lot will suffer a diminution in value of their property, and they awarded based on nuisance theory. Okay, so then the next thing to be done was whether the judge would issue a permanent injunction. So in my mind, if the jury found that's a nuisance, I think that was actually error. I'll talk about that in a minute. But if in fact it's a nuisance, the only remedy is to stop construction. Why would you let a nuisance go up in the middle of a neighborhood? So what did the judge do? Okay, he split the baby. He allowed the damage to go forth, but he's allowing the building to be built. So basically, he's allowing the construction what the jury found to be a nuisance, which is actually somewhat stunning. Now, what I found most remarkable here, I would love your feedback on it, is the actual judge's instruction of what constitutes a nuisance. Okay, so on the jury form, he defined a public nuisance as, quote, abnormal and out of place. The judge defined a nuisance in the instruction as, quote, abnormal and out of place. I have the jury verdict form if you want to look at it later. I think that's reversible error right there. But if you think about it, he's going back to like a boomer, like pre-Euclid understanding of nuisance, because before we had zoning law, you would actually use nuisance law to police land use. And it's almost this interesting dynamic because Houston has no zoning law, so they've had to kind of latch back onto this mid-20th, early 20th century doctrine of public nuisance to try to stop it. They've effectively said, what did Justice Sutherland say in Euclid? A nuisance may be merely a right thing in the wrong place, like a pig in the parlor instead of the barnyard. I mean, that was early 20th century nuisance law, but That's been entirely supplanted by land use, zoning, planning commissions, all these other forums. So I wasn't planning on talking this, but the judge issued his opinion yesterday. I think he has to get reversed as a matter of law because I don't think under Texas law, maybe Kellen, I both your comments on this, that a nuisance can be defined this way. The judge didn't cite a single precedent for this idea. Everything says, vibrations, noise, light, the normal nuisance things. So there's that. So I think this case will probably get reversed. It will go to the Texas Supreme Court without a doubt because this is a potential big chilling effect for developers in Houston. If they know that after they satisfied all the building codes and the safety codes, they need to deal with this bizarre, unpredictable nuisance litigation, there's almost no sense of how a building will be built. They don't know ex ante whether the building will be allowed. This has been going on for 7 years. I think they spent almost $2 million litigating this. Their lawyers' fees must be through the roof. I can't imagine. And you have these neighbors, right? So let's talk more about the neighbors. I hope I don't get a libel suit based on this because they're very litigious. These are very. I'm being serious.
You should record yourself.
No, I was on NPR about this week, so I'll get a libel suit anyway. They are very wealthy. This is a very affluent area. And if you see these houses, these are like $1 million houses. They're very nice. One of the lead plaintiffs, her husband is an attorney, and they spend countless hours litigating this through every single channel. And I think this is an incident what I've actually been calling backdoor zoning, okay? And specifically backdoor zoning for the wealthy. In most cities, perhaps in New York and otherwise, if someone wants to build something, they need to actually ask the zoning board for permission first. They have to apply for permits. They have to have various hearings. In New York, I don't know how many hearings you have to build, but you have various hearings and notice and comment and all this other stuff. Houston, we don't have any of those channels. We don't have any formal process to allow people to affect land use. So what's actually happening is the only people who can actually impact land use are those who have lawsuits. Those who can actually have the means to go to court and sue to stop these developments. So this is actually an indirect backdoor way of zoning for those with means. I'm positive that if this same development went up on the other side of town, in like the 4th Ward or something, there would be absolutely no means to stop it. These people organized, they built websites, they printed up lawn signs, they staged sit-ins at City Hall. They did all these things, and I think it sets an interesting precedent, right? How do we feel about the ability of people to kind of change their land use? And now in Houston, this is constricted to those who actually have the means and ability to follow these expensive 7-year lawsuits. And if in the event that the Texas Supreme Court, I think, will ultimately hold that this is not a nuisance, the main strategy becomes threatening and delay with vexatious lawsuits, right? They can just threaten and sue. Because these people have apparently the money. It's talking about collective action problems, that all these neighbors have been in this for 7 years, funding all this money to these lawsuits. And I think there's also an interesting public choice angle to this as well, because the very means people can seek these rents are those who are most able to fight it. And this does not bode well for elsewhere. So, and I'm really interested in your comments here, because this will be going up in appeal. I might do an amicus brief on this, because I think as a matter of law, the judge was completely off kilter. But I want to hear your thoughts of how in an unzoned city, nuisance law could be used as a tool of land use as for abnormal places. So I'm going to stop here because I'm much more interested in what you guys have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, thanks. Mark for you. Really interesting. A couple of thoughts and a couple of comments. I don't think the permanent damages and denial of injunction is unprecedented. I think that's what happened.
Yeah.
So essentially, the political responses of the developers are slap suits, and getting the law changed to narrow nuisance law, which is permissible, except I think in Iowa, where there was some kind of takings associated with changing the nuisance law. So those are likely to be easier strategies than the litigation that may proceed concurrently. Mm-hmm. Your observation that wealthy people get different land use is true for a lot of reasons. This is, and a lot of times environmental fights, even if the law's on the books, only in wealthy neighborhoods can people pursue the historic zoning or the litigation up the chain. So there's a larger distribution pattern, of which yours is going to be one example.
Okay. One point before I get to the question. In Houston City Charter, the only way to implement zoning is by popular referendum. So we've had, I think, 2 or 3 votes in the last 30 years, and each time zoning's been defeated. And one interesting note, in the last referendum in like 92, 93, the African-American community came out against zoning because they thought it would increase land prices, which is fascinating because
Isn't an argument plausibly that this holding is undermining a popular referendum, which probably has higher authority? I mean, there's some kind of public policy against zoning, which
the judge acknowledged that in his opinion. It's like, it's not for the court to speak public policy, but here, let me give this instruction anyway. Yes, in the back.
So what I'm really interested in is have you thought about is partially related to Mark's point. Actually, like Larry from just explained it. Partially related to Mark's point, but sort of putting a finer point on it. Thinking about the environmental justice impacts of this, and in essence, what we're talking about here is the ability to do citing decisions sort of willy-nilly, right? So, and I guess what I'm curious about is whether there's any discussion of all of environmental justice in Texas, if there's any other, it's a laughable question, I recognize, as we all start chuckling, but it's a nice thought. But what I guess I wonder is the sort of buying your way to regulation and the environmental justice implications of this. I mean, it's one thing about a high rise, but I'm thinking about sort of more pernicious and polluting uses that could end up within city boundaries, right? So a high rise is unpleasant, but it's arguably not generating harmful externalities in sort of a health conscious way. But I'm thinking more about other kinds of pernicious uses that perhaps no one would ever try and cite in the first place in a wealthy area. But if there's any discussion going on kind of internal to Houston at this point about whether this is problematic, the precedent of this seems to just permit folks in wealthy areas to not only avoid ugly uses, but the kinds of uses that seem more traditionally bound by nuisance, but it leaves poor folks doubly without remedy, not only because of lack of ability to control aesthetics, but sort of even more at a more profound and meaningful level for environmental justice reasons, the kinds of harmful externality generating uses. So I guess
thank you for that comment, and maybe Kellen can contribute. I don't know that much about the Houston environmental law, as whether they have additional things beyond what the state requires. I'm guessing it's Texas. I'm guessing it's probably not too strong. But I think your point about this willy-nilly citing is very problematic on a number of fronts, because ex ante you have no idea if what you're going to build will be okay until you get through 6 or 7 years of litigation. And that's not good for anyone. If you're a developer and you want to build something right, you don't know until a jury says it's a nuisance until you're in trouble. That's why you have a building code, you have a zoning code, you have something in advance that can discern what can't be done.
Hi, Josh. Asmara Tackaway from Texas Southern.
Oh, hi. Hi, good to see you. Yes.
A few comments. One, I think you have to bear in mind that the judges in Houston are elected. Mm-hmm. So that probably was a factor in the judge's decision. So that's one. Two, I also think that you need to contrast the Ashby case with the San Felipe case.
Yes.
Where you have, I would argue, even wealthier individuals who have been defeated. The property, the building is going up in that area. Now, there may be lawsuits, but the building is going up, whereas in the Ashby case, the building is not going up. Third, I would argue that I agree with you that on appeal, this thing is going to be reversed. There's no doubt about it. On the other hand, the damages suit, I don't know where that's going to go. But if the court upholds the damages award, that might be something that developers might just factor in as part of their costs of doing business in Houston. And so not dissimilar from similar costs that developers have to take into account in zone cities generally. And then the other thing, so in the San Felipe case, the folks have money. I don't think they're as organized as the folks in Ashby who have money, although not to the extent that the folks in San Felipe have, and who also are incredibly organized. And I'm going to bring in a third example, which is the Central City example. That was my neighborhood, and we were fighting the Texas Medical Center on what we deemed as an inappropriate use. we didn't have nearly as much money, but we were heavily. And so we had savings and all the other stuff, but we didn't have the money. So we lost that battle, but we eventually got state law changed and we're going to have anything happen. So there are three contrasting examples here that I think it might be useful to use in your paper.
Those are wonderful, and I'm sorry, we've met before. It didn't click, so I apologize. But we're actually cool. We have 3 Houston law professors dealing with land use. That's actually quite cool. I might talk with you later about the Central City. I haven't followed that one too closely, but I'll look into that. Interesting point about the damages, though. That could just be factors that cost of doing business. They could perhaps even try and buy the homeowners off at the beginning rather than having to go through all this litigation. Just say, we'll pay you effectively for an easement to commit a nuisance. I guess.
Holdouts.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. But yeah, the court's ruling, the judge's ruling, was limited to those contiguous to the property. So only a finite number of homes actually touching that lot. Thank you very much.
Sarah Schindler, University of Maine. So, yeah, it's interesting. I've definitely read a bit about Houston and the zoning issues, but as you were talking, it occurred to me that in some ways, I feel like we've seen a trend in a lot of cities away from traditional zoning, right? As we move toward form-based codes, which sounds more akin to what Houston has anyway, which is just more about the size and shape and location of buildings as opposed to what's happening in them. And in those cities that are moving toward form-based codes, and even in cities that are moving toward deregulation or sort of loosening of zoning laws, and the move toward mixed-use zoning, we're seeing people saying, let's just fall back on nuisance. Right, and I think this is an interesting sort of devolution because part of the reason we developed zoning was because we decided nuisance law wasn't working. But now we're seeing people saying, well, maybe we can take a step back and just use nuisance, right? So this is happening with the backyard chickens issues, right? A lot of cities are saying we can allow chickens, it's fine, but we have nuisance law to fall back on. So I'm curious to see if you think, maybe the solution isn't necessarily, moving towards zoning, because I completely agree with what has been said, that zoning favors those with means just as much as this process does. And also, just as you were talking, I kept thinking, I don't know to what extent this would be interesting, but just thinking about the conflict between vested rights doctrine and nuisance law might be interesting in this context.
That's a very good question, and one of the issues in this case that was brought up to the jury was the fact that housing prices are getting very expensive. And people don't want to live 90 minutes outside and have a really long commute. So there's actually a move to try and build more mixed-use developments within the loop, within the main city area. And it was viewed that this actually could be a precedent to have these, instead of having a one house, you have, a 20-story high-rise and basically the same lot size. So the other point you mentioned, I'd like to talk with you after about this, about cities who are moving towards mixed use are actually citing zoning like the chickens. That might be a way of nuisance law coming back in a weird way, but it's just as unpredictable as Boomer. And it doesn't, maybe it does line itself well with the chickens, but when you're talking about a 20-story high-rise, it doesn't get you much when you're trying to build something. Yeah.
I think this is fascinating, and I haven't had enough time to really start thinking through this, but in some ways it seems like a good outcome. Like you can build this thing, but then you have to pay for you sort of internalize, you pay for the externalities that you're creating. Maybe the developers will just take this into account. I want to build a building, and I'm going to make an offer to all the people that I'm going to sort of affect. And maybe it's not a perfect offer, right? But maybe this gets us closer to the cozy and efficient outcome.
It's interesting, yeah.
You make the offer contingent on everybody accepting.
Yeah.
Then you create full pressure to go the other way.
So I have a point to that, just from living in Houston. As you point out, Houston is just doing this all over the place, and it's not, I live near Rice too, but I don't live in that neighborhood near Rice, and there are giant apartment complex, condo buildings going up near me, but we're not, I don't own my house, but I don't think my landlord and I don't think the neighbors are being offered deals. I think this was a one-off, San Felipe being another one, these very organized and very wealthy areas, but this is happening all over, and this law isn't operating. It's happening, maybe it would be a good thing if it actually is kind of more institutionalized and worked fairly, but it's not. It's not even just poor neighborhoods. It's not happening, and it's not happening in middle-income neighborhoods.
And that's exactly right. There's no way of making this happen unless people file a lawsuit, right? As opposed with the zoning board, it has to go through this channels regardless.
But then you get sort of this is the principle. Then you get like plaintiffs lawyers. Sort
Oh
of
God!
So you should file an amicus brief on the other side.
Oh,
We just want more permanent.
You need to turn off the That's right.
I'm
We've
going to
got
make
a cottage industry of lawyers to sue about this.
one last comment, and then we'll move on to Paul Piper. Well, actually, two small comments. Really an interesting problem you've identified. One is, I think there's a story here you can tell about. It is true that there are all sorts of distributional problems with zoning, but I think this underscores that at least you get some voice, and it may be imperfect, but you have to think about, consider the alternatives, right? And so in New York, it's an imperfect process, but at least the community boards get involved, and there is some way to assert to extract some public benefit as developers go through the process, some formalized way that keeps. I mean, there's still lawsuits, there's still problems, but at least there's some way to channel that public voice in, however imperfectly. The second is just a reflection on, you quoted one part of Euclid, but I was struck by a kind of irony to another part of Euclid, where Sutherland talks about parasites, that multifamily buildings are parasites.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a sort of underlying rationale to the justification for land use regulation against the background principle that he says is not nuisance, but it gives us a fairly helpful clue, misspelling clue, or spelling clue in this really interesting way, right? And it strikes me that there's an interesting, I don't know whether it's merely just an irony, but in some ways, at the sort of foundation of the regulatory rationale for zoning law since the 1920s is the idea that multifamily housing in a single-family housing zone can be problematic, can be so problematic that we can invoke the power of the state to limit it, right? So there is one version of this story which says that this is just going back to a kind of vision of a way of thinking about externalities that was implicitly validated in Euclid. I don't know if you want to go there.
No, that's. I mean, we're not talking about building slums. These are going to be very expensive condos with very expensive people, grad students, professors at Rice. This is going to be some really high quality. There's going to be like a Starbucks on the first floor. We're not talking about some like low level grade. These are very nice things. So there is a sense that we don't want multifamily people in this one family zone. They want to keep their community as it is. And there's always this tension with zoning. We want to keep things as they are. Stop change, right? We don't want anything to change. Let's live the same way we've been living for 30 years. Keep these outsiders out. And now they are invoking the strong arm of the state to stop that, and it's a fascinating dynamic.
All right, great. We should actually move on. But thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. I'd be happy to.
Far away.
Hi, good morning. Paul Diller, Willamette University.